All right, now to the latest on the U.S.'s threats against Iran. It has long been known that Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu have been egging the U.S. on against Iran. But in the past few days, it's become evident that the Saudis may want the U.S. to hit Iran as much or even more so, actually, as Israel does. The Saudis today were publicly asking for the United States to hit Iran with, quote, surgical strikes. That's what they say, surgical strikes. And they should do so in retaliation for Iran's attack on oil tankers in the Gulf. John Jordan is a former naval intel officer who joins us now to talk about the situation between the United States and Iran. John, should it not give us pause? Let me begin with this. Should it not give us pause as Americans that the guys who are cheerleading on our behalf, pulling for us to attack Iran, are the Saudis, whose reputation, let me remind you, is not impeccable?
Well, Rick, what I think we're seeing here in the Middle East is the first time in several generations a realignment of interests and alliances. For the first time, the perceived common threat of Iran is changing the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel, who historically have been at war, but now are putting aside their differences, albeit discreetly and quietly, in the face of a common foe. So I think you have a Saudi interest and Israeli interest pulling us in that direction.
No, the Israelis are suddenly friends with the Saudis. What gives?
Well, they're not technically friends, right? They're still technically in a state of war. And for political reasons, domestically, inside the kingdom, the Saudi government can't say we're friends with Israel now. But they're having quiet contacts, and they are cooperating.
So the Crown Prince and the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, are buddies, but their people are not supposed to know they like each other? Is that what you're saying?
Essentially, that's it, Rick. Essentially, that's the long and the short of it.
There's a difference between business and business, right? Now, are you concerned that because these other factions in this part of the world are pushing for this to happen, that all it's going to take is one little thing to trigger something that's going to get out of hand, and it's going to cause well, a calamity for the world, for the region, if nothing else?
Well, a couple things. There is some instability here because Tehran does not exactly have the degree of control over many of these militant groups and some of these organizations that everybody thinks they have. So something may happen, action may be taken against a U.S. ship or some oil shipping or something of that nature that isn't actually being done on Tehran's orders, but may trigger a U.S. response. Now, do I think there'd be a conflagration? No, it'd be more like surgical strikes. As Ali Shahabi today, the head of the Saudi Foundation here in Washington, actively came out and said it, that they would like to see a lot of Iranian military, air and sea military capabilities, quote unquote, defanged. And I think that's what they'd like to see is a degradation in Iran's ability to interfere with sea traffic.
But that word defang and that word, I think you said strategic strike or what?
Surgical strike.
Surgical strike. It sounds great. Okay, on paper. And it sounds great when we say it. Oh, we're so good. But you and I have been through this dog and pony show before. I remember the Gulf War. I remember the situation with Iraq. We were all so impressed with these pretty surgical strikes, and we all thought we would suddenly live in a world where you pressed a button, you eliminated your enemy, and the next day everything was great. Boy, John, if we learned anything from Iraq is that's bullcrap. It doesn't work that way. 8 years later, 17 years later in Afghanistan, where they're fighting and the situation is a mess, right?
War is by definition a messy business. Now, if you want to compare it to the carpet bombing of World War II, yes, it is a lot. The extraneous damage, the collateral damage is a lot less common than it used to be. It's also very intel dependent. If the U.S. gets bad intel on a target, and it turns out that it's school or a hospital, or the other side actually put people there to actually have casualties on TV, you can have that type of thing. So it's also intel dependent.
Let me ask you something about what would happen if we continue accusing Iran of everything we're accusing them of, and if we take it even a step further and try and degrade them, not just economically, but militarily, and continue to do it in such an outward fashion that I believe it comes to the point where the people inside Iran, who we may want to have them turn against their government, do just the opposite and start turning more against us because they see us as the aggressors. Isn't that a fear?
That is absolutely well placed. You can, in a strange way, you can argue that the Saudis, the Israelis, and the Iranian regime all want the same thing. Strange, but you got to think about it. And that is, they all may want us to actually strike at Iran. And here's why. The Saudis stated his reasons. Israel obviously is concerned with the Iranian regime, but the Iranian regime may want it too, because the Iranian economy is in free fall. The rial, their unit of currency, has lost over 80% of its value. Inflation is quadrupled. The Iranian regime is its back is against the wall. And a lot of governments, it's a time-honored tactic, will often want to have a rally round the flag effect. And in this case, a foreign attack on Iranian soil might be just what the Iranian regime wants.
It's funny you say that because, as you know, because I think I've told you 5,000 times, I'm Cuban, right? So I grew up hearing people say that the greatest thing that ever happened to Fidel Castro was U.S. threats against Cuba. That he would use that as a rallying cry to get people around him. And he became kind of a romanticized, heroic figure in Cuba because the United States kept saying, we're going to hit them, and he kept saying, they're going to hit us any moment now, I'll protect you. Isn't that the same kind of thing that could happen in Iran?
And that is the risk for the U.S. here, is overreach to actually give the mullahs and the regime in Iran material they can use to extend their reign and divert attention from their domestic
But you're
problems.
a rational guy. You're a lawyer. You're smart. You're super educated, and you wear really cool suits. So you can figure that out. Can John Bolton, a guy with a 1920s mustache, figure that out?
I hope so. But U.S. overreach here by being too bellicose, you look at the Iranian state media, can backfire. The threat the other day of 120,000 troops, the New York Times talked about, whether or not that you can argue whether that's really smart or not. It may be that Trump is using Bolton as kind of like the bad guy, the lever to scare people.
There's talk about that.
It's a good cop, bad cop. It may be the case, or it may end up being inflammatory and actually be more helpful to the Iranian regime. It's hard to know.
Yeah, John Jordan, thanks as usual. Thanks for visiting. It really is a nice suit, by the way. It really looks good. I'm Rick Sanchez. You found us on YouTube, and that's awesome. But you know what? I'm also live every night at 7 and 8 p.m. Eastern on DirecTV and Dish and cable and satellite, the RT app, and Pluto TV. I'll see you there.